I want to start today by discussing a common misconception that is shared among victims of cheating parasites. Whoa, you might be thinking, did you just call cheaters parasites? Yes, I did, because that's kind of what they are. Merriam Webster's dictionary defines a parasite as an organism living in, on, or with another organism in order to obtain nutrients, grow, or multiply, often in a state that directly or indirectly harms the host. Sound familiar? The cheater's happiness is paramount to everything and everyone else, even their children or their family. There are no exceptions, and they will hide and lie and conceal and distort the truth to avoid being seen for what they really are. And like a parasite, a cheater will latch onto the host. Spoiler alert, you're the host. And they latch onto the affair partner or partners. And then they extract whatever they feel entitled to: attention, flattery, easy sex, whatever they want and whenever they want it. They snap their fingers and you come running to them, arms wide open, all too eager to give them whatever they need because you love them. You meant it when you married them, that they're the only one for you. That's what you thought love meant. Monogamy isn't some archaic concept shrouded in mystery and subjective opinion, despite what some thought leaders or therapists might have you believe. It's actually pretty important and vital to the health of long term relationships and families. Worst of all, the cheated often falsely assume they can convince their abuser to stop betraying them. If you heard the very first episode of this podcast, you might remember John V's story, where she pleaded with her then boyfriend to just leave her. Don't cheat on me, she begged him. Just leave me if you aren't happy. But cheaters can't help themselves because that's their nature, to attach and extract. And believe it or not, they aren't actually eager to leave the relationship at all because they don't want to lose everything that being with you provides: financial or familial support, childcare, housing, sex, companionship, whatever. All the things they've taken for granted are very important to them, and they aren't necessarily prepared to give it all up and move in with their shiny new toy. Because cheaters are actually smart enough to understand that the honeymoon phase will eventually pass, and they'll have to face new challenges and obstacles as the boiling excitement is reduced to a simmer. It won't be long before their new partner isn't meeting all of their needs either. And then invariably the story just repeats itself, and they find another host and suckle the life force out of them too. Cheaters cheat. It's what they do because that's their nature, to attach to a host and take whatever they can get until they've left a lifeless carcass behind. Today's guest is sharing a story that's a little different than the average one you might read about, because everyone in this tale is a victim and everyone is a perpetrator. No one's hands are clean here. But there's disparity in how the parties have attempted reconciliation and healing. And as you might soon learn, sincerity and humility are critical ingredients in recovering a relationship from infidelity. Gabe, welcome to the show.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
Let's start at the beginning. Give me a brief history of your relationship and how long you've been together with your, I don't know if they're a spouse or partner or just a girlfriend, and just the general health of the relationship in its early days.
Well, we've been together a little over 11 years and married for coming up on 10 years. Um, we met back in the early 20 teens. I had just moved back from overseas, back stateside. I'm a military officer. So, um, I was looking to settle down and find a relationship after kind of having, a wild time overseas in the military. And so I started joining some of the dating apps, which is kind of the early days of the dating apps. I mean, pre Tinder. And I was seeing some women, but they really weren't women that I could see anything long term with. And ultimately, I was actually waiting for another woman I was seeing on a date, and my future wife ended up messaging me and saying, "Hey, I'm shutting down my account here, but you should email me here." So I mean, right off the bat, it sounded like a scam. But anyway, we ended up talking, and it took a few weeks to actually meet up with her. I mean, I volunteered to drive, and to where she was living and meet up with her there. And she always seemed to be busy and didn't have the time or whatever, which obviously seems suspect to me. I mean, if you really wanted to meet up, you'd meet up. But, one Saturday night, she kind of texted me super late and said, "Hey, do you want to meet up?" So I said, "Sure." And I was like, "Are you serious? It's after midnight, whatever." But she said, "Sure." So I went up and obviously we met up and hit it off right away. And honestly, it kind of progressed pretty quickly after that. I mean, we were deeply attached and inseparable, like right off the bat, um, kind of in a problematic way in hindsight. And things progressed pretty quickly. I mean, I'd never really been in a serious adult relationship before. And so it was all kind of new territory for me. But um, it wasn't much more than a couple of months before I kind of started feeling a little bit controlled. I mean, she was very adamant about always knowing where I was, or if I didn't respond right away to texts, she would kind of blow up at me. And so I just kind of felt like I was always playing damage control with her and trying to resolve the situation, appease her. But either way, it was kind of really good, and then we'd argue, and really good, and then we'd argue, and it kind of went like that way for a while. Ultimately, I was moving out of state because I had met her in a location. I was there for training, and she didn't know that right off the bat. So it was kind of a bait and switch. But ultimately, she decided that she was going to follow me, and we ended up, moving out of state and living together. And honestly, within about 9 months, I think I proposed to her. And there was a lot of red flags initially I ignored, but I just kind of assumed this is adult relationship. They take work, and I just assumed that I was kind of at fault and needed to learn and grow. And again, trying to appease her and make her happy. As things progressed, it was kind of odd in that my job sometimes would take me out of town, and if I left for the weekend, she would run back home to her hometown where we met. And my family kind of brought that up. She's kind of gone a lot, and that's kind of an odd situation. If you guys are going to be, together as a couple, especially if you're getting married, like you kind of need to live together. But I'd go out of town, she'd leave, and then she'd say, "Ah, well, why don't you stack a couple of those trips together, and that way it makes me driving home worth it." So honestly, it kind of progressed like that, even after we got married, where she was really gone probably half the time that we lived in that one location. And again, my parents aren't one to meddle. My sister, same thing. But they kind of brought up it's kind of odd that she's never there. I mean, you're supposedly married, and she's gone half the time. It's kind of an odd situation. But I just assumed it's the nature of my job, and it's just something we needed to work on. And I was busy with grad school, and she was trying to find a job and trying to find a career path. So I just kind of explained it all away, as we often do.
Real quick, so when it sounds like you got to work pretty quick with this woman. You moved across out of town. You've been together for 9 months. You proposed. Did you have family with you, or is this just like a brand new start for both of you in a new town?
No, brand new start. Yeah, military orders. So we just moved to a new location that neither of us were super thrilled to be there, but honestly, we had a great time. It was great people. Um, but yeah, I felt like she couldn't really separate from her family of origin. She was kind of always going back, and it just seemed like a failure to thrive. Like she couldn't break out and make her own life. I always felt like I was competing with her family. That makes sense.
Yeah.
But ultimately, after that job, I had to go uh, to a different job, which ultimately was going to have me away for 9 months out of the 16 months that I was going to be in that assignment. So we ultimately decided that I was going to get out of the military, and we moved back to her hometown so she'd be near family, and because that's where she wanted to live. And I at least promised her that once we got out, we'd live near her family because I had no real ties to living back where I grew up. So I bought a house, and she moved back into that. I went to this sort of geo bachelor situation where I went on deployment, and sure enough, she got pregnant right before we left, and parted ways. So I essentially missed the entire pregnancy. Obviously, keeping up with email and internet and FaceTime and all that stuff when we could. But I made it back, obviously, for the birth, and came back as often as I could until I could leave that assignment and finally move back in together. And I was all but set to get out, but another opportunity came up to make my sort of segue into the civilian world a little easier. So we decided to take one more set of orders for 3 years to another location, and we moved there together and tried to start our new family life with our first child. And things started to really go downhill at that point. Again, this job kind of had me going out of town for short periods of time, sometimes a couple of weeks at a time. And again, every time I'd leave, she just couldn't bear to be in the house by herself. So she'd go back to her family and stay there, and then I'd come back and be like, "Well, why don't you take another trip and go out and do some more training or whatever I had to do, and I'll come back after the next one." And again, much like the last assignment, it was I'd be gone for multiple trips, and she'd be out of state for months. And again, probably about half the time I was in that assignment, she was gone. And again, my parents, they don't really meddle, but they were just kind of like, "That's pretty odd. You guys are married, you have a kid, and you're just never together. I don't know why she can't just stay there and you guys make it work. If you're gone for a couple of weeks, it's not a big deal." But again, she's very convincing, and I kind of defended her with all of her talking points as to why that didn't make sense and why she needed help, and having a baby was hard and this and that. So I kind of defended her to them, and thought things would get better, but ultimately they didn't. As time progressed, she got a lot more abusive, I guess you could say, at least verbally, emotionally, very emasculating, a lot of name calling, a lot of berating, which is sort of at odds because obviously I have a pretty technical job, a pretty important job, and she just made me feel like I was incompetent at basic things, whether it was just how I'm doing the dishes or how I take care of the kids. And essentially I missed the entire pregnancy, so any thoughts I had on how to raise the kids or child rearing, it was basically I didn't get a say because I missed too much of it, and she and her mom had figured out the best way to do things. So I was just kind of like in the back seat along for the ride with everything that she dictated in her home life.
So you're being deployed, you're getting moved around. It sounds like you moved maybe at least a couple different times just in the first few years of your relationship.
Yes.
She goes back home to where her family is. So you're and then I'm a little confused. So then you would come back in a town, the place where you've moved, or you would go back to where she's staying with her family?
Well, it's funny because I would come back to where we live, but half the time if she was gone, I would try to like take leave and come back and go visit her where her family was from, and kind of split my time because obviously, especially with a kid, it's hard for her to move back and forth with a small kid. So sometimes I'd come home, sometimes I'd go, visit her with her family and then go back to our place alone. It was just very complicated and hectic.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
But so as time progressed, just all the things I was hoping would change. I figured having a kid would sort of solidify our nuclear family and make us uh, more of a collective family by ourselves and separate her from her family of origin, which it just seemed like she was constantly going back to. But obviously that wasn't the case. And her constant emotional abuse and name calling and berating and emasculating and all that stuff, like it's not an excuse, but it definitely kind of led me to sort of shut down, and I would just stonewall. I felt like I was walking on eggshells all the time. I really had no opinions about anything because anything would set her off, and I was drinking more, and just I was not the best person during that time because I didn't really know what to do. So we were kind of in this tenuous situation where she wasn't happy, I wasn't happy. We're barely living together, and it kind of came to a head for me when I was overseas, and we got into one of these arguments where I expressed the things that I wanted to do in life and some of my goals, and she kind of just blew up at me and said, "Well, you want all these things, and you want to do this, and you want to do that, and I'm never going to be that person. I'm never going to do those things. I don't want to live in those places. I don't want to do those things. So you need to find somebody that will do that because that's not me." And then we kind of just like broke off the call. And later on that night, I went out with a group of my colleagues out in Europe and came back to our hotel situation. We were all hanging out, but ultimately, it ended up being me alone with this other coworker of mine who was ironically in the same sort of situation as me with significant troubles with her husband. And it ultimately led to us kind of making out and fooling around, which in the moment I didn't really see it coming, but obviously in hindsight I realized there's probably about 15 different decisions that night that led to the situation where I ultimately made the big choice, right? So it wasn't planned. It wasn't something I thought about. I didn't really see her in that light kind of until the moment. But as soon as I pulled the trigger, I realized it was wrong. But, at that point, I kind of felt like, I jumped off the cliff, so you might as well. And, we probably fooled around for maybe a few times, like 3, 4 times over the course of a week before we parted ways. And obviously after the immediacy of the thrill of it, and getting that validation from somebody new after being treated so poorly for so long, at least how I justified it in my head, all that stuff wears off, and you kind of come back to the reality of this is just an insane situation, and it was wrong,
Hmm.
and I felt badly, and I just didn't really know what to do. And then, of course, her husband found out through a linked iPad, and that just made things even worse. Where he's confronting me and blowing me up. And at one point, I was just like, he's threatening me to tell my wife, and I just said, you know what, man, do what you got to do. I'm sorry this happened. I didn't really understand your situation. I thought they were getting divorced, but do what you got to do. And I kind of just blocked him at that point, and figured it was only a matter of time before my wife found out. So I kind of just went through the motions of living life, kind of a shell of a person. I mean, she wasn't really even there half the time. And, things carried on for a few months until uh, we were on a family vacation with her family. And, through everything that was going on as things were deteriorating, and obviously the guilt of what I had done, again, I reached out inappropriately to a girl I'd been with many, many years ago. She was happily married. There was nothing there, but I basically felt I couldn't talk to anybody in my current life about that situation, just given the risk of everything that was involved. So I kind of shared with this random person outside my sphere everything that was going on, and not about the affair per se, but all about all the issues I had with the marriage and how it just didn't seem normal to me, and what was wrong with the situation, and shared things that you really shouldn't share about your marriage with somebody else. So it was definitely inappropriate, definitely an emotional affair, and ultimately she discovered that situation, and things just blew up from there. Where
Your wife discovered it. Is that what you mean?
that's correct, yeah.
Okay, so did the husband of your affair partner did he contact your wife, or how did she find out?
No, not the affair partner. This is the just the girl that I was talking to about my marital problems. That's the conversation that she had
Right, but the
discovered.
husband confronted you said, and that he threatened to tell your wife.
He did, and I basically left it off with "Do what you got to do." I'm sorry, and I blocked him, and that's the
Oh,
last I heard
okay, so
about it.
he didn't. Okay, gotcha. So this I understand now.
Well, he did in a way, but I found out years later. But yeah, she never found out from him, but he attempted.
So just to rewind a little bit here, it sounds like a lot of this started with your traveling, her going back to her hometown to be with her family while you're gone, you're overseas. Sounds like you're being deployed or something, or just being given different assignments. Is that the reason you think that she was so emasculating and rude to you? It was just the distance and she was tired of it?
Yeah, I mean, if you would talk to her, I would say that she'd tell you that basically, I left her alone all the time, and I wasn't any help to her. And, she was basically a single mother and doing all this on her own, so she needed the help, and I wasn't providing enough. And because I was gone all the time, she had to go home to have her family help her out. That's probably what she would tell you.
Okay. And so after so then fast forward to the affair that you had with this other woman, did things end after the husband confronted you? Did you talk to her again?
Oh yeah. I mean, as soon as we were done and we parted ways, and the husband, I mean, it was just like, we didn't speak to each other, we didn't talk to, we didn't even look at each other. Like, we did whatever we had to do in the workplace if it was in passing, but yeah, I mean, we basically weren't speaking anymore. I'm sure her husband put many limits on her of, don't even speak to me. So yeah, that was done almost immediately.
So then you started talking to somebody else, another woman?
Correct. This was a woman out of state, far away, who I hadn't spoken to in many years. But it was, yeah, it was basically just sort of a trauma dump on her as to everything going wrong with my marriage, my life.
And she's the one that told your wife?
No, my wife snuck into my phone and she found that conversation.
Oh, I see. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
And how did that go? What happened when she found out?
Well, in hindsight, it's hard to tell exactly what was going on with context, but at the time, she basically, threatened divorce, and this is an emotional affair, and essentially you cheated on me, and again, I was kind of just resigned, obviously still holding on to the guilt of actually having a real affair, and I basically just said, look, I'm sorry, it was inappropriate, I really didn't mean anything by it, which I really didn't, because obviously I had no intentions with this woman who was married out of state for many years, like whatever the conversation was inappropriate for sure, but I had no intentions there. But again, I was trying to not necessarily explain it away. I was trying to take accountability and say, look, I'm sorry, it was wrong, but either let's get divorced or not, but we can't keep punishing me forever for this, which again is not necessarily the right answer, recovering from infidelity, but that's kind of where we were at. But ultimately she decided, okay, we're going to make this work. And I brought up a lot of the issues that I had of just like, you're never here. Like, we can't build a marriage if we're never together. At least while I'm home, we have to be a family and this and that. And obviously, she ultimately conceded that, okay, I'll come back. And I was going to get out of the military anyway. So it was like, well, then you need to buy us a house for us to live in. Um, but she was kind of on the fence, and I was like, listen, like, we need to figure out if we're staying married before I just buy a house with you. I mean, that's obviously not a good situation if this is going to go south. So is there any sort of guarantee that we can actually work this out? And ultimately I conceded and just bought the house and ultimately made the exit from the military, which of course was right during COVID, so that made things even worse.
So she wasn't pushing for a divorce?
She was debating it, but ultimately decided against it, which again, I'm not really sure what her thoughts were at the time. I think she would say it was just a matter of like, well, I figured it was, stay together for the kids, it's better for them. And, I guess maybe the emotional affair wasn't that bad in her mind, whatever her reasoning was. But no, she ultimately ended up deciding not to get divorced at the time. And, we stuck it out.
Okay, because I don't get to talk to people that cheat a whole lot, and it's your business. You got to do what you got to do. I do want to ask you a couple of questions about it.
Absolutely.
Did you, after she found out and she confronted you about it, did you disclose everything to her that happened? Were you an open book?
No, I was not. And the reason being is my perception of her at the time was that she would never tolerate that. I mean, that to me, to both of us, it seemed at the time was a deal breaker. I mean, never in my life that I would ever assume I was going to do that. And I figured she would absolutely not be tolerant to it. So at the time I was just kind of thinking, well, she wants to get divorced. So what's the point in telling her now? And then when she kind of backpedaled, I just, I ultimately made the wrong choice and said, well, I guess if the husband never told her and she's not going to find out, then I mean, the only way to stay married is to not tell her. So I didn't at the time.
A lot of people, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, and I don't even know the next chapter of your story. So, but when you decided to get together with this other woman, you describe it as being a very spontaneous event. You met this woman, you liked her, and you got together. A lot of people ask the question. I raised this in the introduction. Why don't cheaters just leave? Was there at any moment during this process when you met this other woman overseas where you said to yourself, "This is not the way to handle it. The right thing to do is if I want out of the relationship, I need to exit it first and then pursue something with somebody else."
That is a completely valid question. And again, the only way I can really describe it is going to sound almost like it's defending the cheating, which it's not. I acknowledge the fact that it's wrong, and under no circumstances is it justifiable. But it's not, because of the spontaneity of it. It's not like I could just call off the marriage while I'm overseas and this opportunity arises. It was just sort of in the moment. um, and this is again on the heels of basically my wife saying, go find somebody else to do the things you want, because that's not me, and basically treating me like trash for many years. It's not right, but that's kind of the headspace that I was in that ultimately allowed it to happen. So I can't really explain it in a way that doesn't sound like it's defending it, but that's kind of the headspace that I was in.
How much time had passed between the last time that you had seen your wife, and then this affair with the other woman overseas? Like, how many months or weeks or whatever was it?
It was probably a couple of weeks, and yeah, again, the last time I left her, I think she was probably at her parents' place. I went back to our place, and then that's where I left overseas. So it's just kind of like it was a very distant time. It was a very um, you know tenuous time. Just again, we had our second kid, and she had sort of doubled down on the abusive language and stuff like that. So we just really weren't in a good place, and it had been a couple of weeks, and then it was sort of that culminating phone call of just like, go find somebody because that ain't me, and it was literally like that night when it all went down.
So she told you all that, like, go find somebody else. She told you that on the phone when you're already overseas?
Correct. We were on the phone and kind of got into a blow up argument, and that's kind of where we left off.
Do you think that in the back of your mind that gave you sort of a moral pat I'm not sure how to word this, like a moral pass to go ahead and just meet somebody else and say, well, my wife doesn't even really want to be with me. She told me to go find somebody else. She's not happy with me. She's emasculating. She's offensive and insulting. She puts me down. You know, did that? You do you think that I imagine that has to have some significant role in your decision making?
Yeah, I think it has to, right? I mean, you'd be crazy to not acknowledge the fact that has to give you some sort of moral free pass to kind of do what you want. But honestly, I think in the heat of the moment, it was probably just more the validation of like somebody actually being kind to me, and like validating the fact that, like, yeah, that's not right to treat you that way, that kind of thing, which is again is something that you read about a lot in sort of the infidelity space of the reason, at least one of the circumstances of cheating is two kind of broken people finding each other and commiserating over their shared experience, which again, not an excuse, but it's a pretty common circumstance.
And not that I wanna, beat a dead horse with this story because I wanna go to the next chapter, but this
Sure.
woman's husband, did she tell you that it sounds like maybe you mentioned that she was discussing that she would get a divorce from him, is that right?
Yes, I didn't know her story. I mean, because we're all in the same unit, and we kind of deployed, for short stints around the world, and she happened to be out there at the time. But having known about her, at least known her for a short period of time, there was a lot of sort of rumors going around the squadron about her marital problems, and it sounded like the rumors that I heard that she was basically on track to getting a divorce. So in my mind, I really wasn't 100% sure of their status, but at least at the time, I was convinced that they were basically on the path to divorce. So I don't know how much that really had a bearing on my choice to do what I did. I think I'd be dishonest in saying that did, but at least that was what I thought what was her situation at the time.
Okay, so you come back and your wife finds out, she confronts you, you say, "Well, maybe we should get a divorce." You kinda, I guess, give her a way out, it sounds like. You didn't try to necessarily, and correct me if I'm wrong, it doesn't sound like you tried necessarily real hard to keep her and, make promises and love bomb her, as the expression goes, and just keep her in your life. Uh, you were, I don't know, it sounds like you're somewhat apathetic almost about it. Is that a fair description?
It's true. I mean, it's probably a combination of both, just my general affect of just being kind of broken from just years of this tumultuous relationship, coupled with the fact that I really didn't know how to reconcile what I had done that she still didn't know about, to sort of create a happy and healthy marriage going forward. And I kind of felt guilty about it, in a lot of ways that I really didn't know how to make right. So, yeah, I think I was just sort of numb, and it was just like, well, in hindsight, I think in a lot of ways, my behavior after the fact was not one of necessarily like you read about the narcissists that kind of overcompensate and they do the love bombing. I was kind of almost the opposite, in that I was just sort of apathetic and in a way maybe just trying to lead her to lead me because I just felt so guilty about the whole situation.
So what happens next? Take me to the next chapter. What happens next in the saga?
So ultimately, COVID's a difficult time. Um, my career field was all but shut down on the cusp of COVID. So I ended up staying in the military for another 6 months or so. Again, the whole time I had moved her back to Texas, so I didn't really have a place to live where my unit was at the time. So I was just like going overseas because I didn't have a place to live otherwise. So I was just like, well, let them pay for a room and send me wherever they got to send me. Ultimately, I ended up getting out and transitioned into a civilian career. And everything was always in our relationship like light at the end of the tunnel because I always promised things would get better and down the road and I had a vision in mind, which I was on track to make, but she was just always very impatient with that. And the hope was that this career change would mean more time at home and things would get better. But ultimately, it just felt like nothing had changed, and I was around, but I just felt constantly like she thought it was useless and not helpful, and um, yeah, it got worse and worse to the point where I think within the first year after I'd separated, we kind of sat down and I just said like, look, are you happy? Is this the way you want to live for the next 40 years of your life? And she said, well, no. And I said, well, I'm not either. Do you want to just kind of give it to the end of the year and really think about it and see if we want to part ways or not? And she said, okay. And that's kind of where we were at. We're just kind of going through the motions, which ultimately looked like it was going to lead towards a divorce in the near future. We were both just kind of contemplating. And, it got to a point where it was sort of like the straw that broke the camel's back, which, of course, one of the top reasons for divorce, finances, right? So, obviously I took a pay cut for the initial period once I got out with this new job because there's always a probationary period in my field for the first year or so. So I was kind of on a pay cut and we were a little bit tight.
And real quick, she doesn't work. You're the sole breadwinner, right?
Oh, she does. She does work, but obviously I'm the primary breadwinner.
Okay.
But in this situation, I still earn more than she did, even on a probationary period. But it was a pay cut from what we were used to. And there were times where the bank account would be empty. She'd pull all the money out and pay her credit card off because she was spending like an exorbitant amount on her credit card every month. And it got to a point where I said, look, like you can't pull that much money out. I got to pay the mortgage. I got to pay taxes, like all these things that all of a sudden I'd go to pay and the money wasn't there. So I said, look, we need to split finances, at least for now, until we get back to the pay increase and can manage this a little bit better. And she basically just snapped and said, well, if we're splitting the finances, what are we even doing? And so she's just like, let's file for divorce. Like, I'm done. And initially I was so frustrated that I was kind of on board with that too. I mean, I was unhappy at the time, but so I got an attorney, and ultimately she beat me to the punch and had filed first and was essentially waiting to serve me. But all of a sudden I got really cold feet, and I was just not going down that path anymore. I really didn't want to get divorced. I came to the realization that for so many years she'd blamed me for a lot of this stuff, and I really kind of internalized that. And I told her, I was like, listen, I know we said this stuff before, but I don't think I've been the best husband, the best father. There's some changes that I think I can make that would make you happier, that hopefully would improve our lives. Like, please just give me the chance to make those changes. And ultimately, she said, nope, I'm done. One foot out the door. I mean, we basically had agreed to kind of like look on the dating app, see what else is out there, and see if that was something we wanted or if we wanted to stay together. And I guess she found some dudes and was happy and just said, nope, I'm done. I want nothing to do with you. We're going to get divorced. So I was kind of getting frantic. Again, I was traveling for my job and I'd be on the road, just, getting into really, really dark places and hotel rooms late at night. So I was begging and pleading with her to reconsider and try and figure this out.
Why did you want to stay in the marriage?
For me, it was, I don't know. I'm deeply self-conscious in a lot of ways. And I felt like the narrative that she'd given me for so long was that this was all essentially my fault. And I really believe that. I believe that, I had done a lot of awful things. I mean, I wasn't, the best father. I wasn't the most helpful around the house. I was drinking a lot. I mean, a lot of stuff that I took ownership of and said, I know I can do a better job. And, this is all my fault. So I just felt guilty about, breaking up a marriage and messing up the kids' lives when ultimately there were things within my power that I could have done to fix that or potentially fix that. So there was a lot of guilt on my part, and I just really didn't want the divorce at that time because I felt like there was a lot of things that we should have tried first. But ultimately, she relented after a few weeks and said, okay, like we'll make this work. And I was just like, you know, blown away, and I was so happy, and I was super excited, and I started making changes immediately. I mean, I stopped drinking immediately. I started working out. I went to therapy. I was helping around the house. I was doing laundry. I was cooking, cleaning. I was doing all the things that she wanted me to do. And at first things were good. She was loving again, and things seemed like they were improving. But as I came to realize later on, these things go in cycles, and that probably only lasted a couple months before the berating returned and the emasculation and making me feel worthless, and it kind of just seemed to go right back to where it was. And I had multiple conversations with her, and I said, look, am I doing the things that you wanted? Like, have I made the changes? And she had told me, she's like, yeah, you're a totally different person. You're the man that I love. Like, you're all the things I wanted, but then it was just hot and cold. It was, good and then really bad. And I said, like, are you still interested in this marriage? Like, do you want to be with me, or are you having second thoughts? Like, do you want to be with somebody else? Like, I would rather you tell me. Like, I didn't want to lose you, but I've done everything I can. So if you really don't want to be with me, just tell me. Like, that'd be a lot less painful than you lying to me and then wanting to, still see other guys. But she assured me, like, no, you have to be patient. It takes time. She was very, hesitant with sex and all these other things that, in hindsight seem like obvious red flags. But, to me, it was just like, well, I'll just keep on doing what I'm doing and do the best I can. And, there is to some extent an element that I have to win her back because she had fallen out of love with me, or so she told me. But she was assuring me that I was doing all the right things and I was, a whole different person. So I kind of just continued on, and I thought things would, improve over time, and they ultimately didn't. Um, and, another interesting point was I had this random opportunity to switch jobs to sort of my dream job at one point. And, she was, supportive at the time of going to the interview and whatever. But, then I actually got the job, and she kind of turned good news into bad news. She was just like, really? You want to start over again? Like now? Like, why? What's the point? This is stupid. Because again, you kind of start over in a probationary year in this career field. So it's kind of like taking a step back to take two steps forward. So it didn't strike me at the time, but in hindsight, it's pretty obvious that like whenever something good happens to you, that's bad for them. That's kind of a toxic trait. But I didn't really recognize it at the time, and I just assured her it was going to be better in the long run. So I had to go for training again for that job for a couple months, and while we were apart, things just really deteriorated even further. She was really combative, really aggressive, really abusive again. And I kind of started talking to my dad, and I was like, look, we've been doing this for a couple of years. I mean, he knew about our tumultuous past and all that. And he just said, look, like, you have to make a decision for yourself. I won't tell you what to do. That's up for you to decide. But if you're even contemplating a divorce, you should probably at least talk to an attorney just to have them sort of waiting in the wings. So I did. And I reached out to an attorney and I said, look, I really hope I don't need your services, but here's what's going on. And hopefully we never speak again, but I wanted to retain you now just in case that happens. And ultimately, I didn't talk to him for many months. I mean, I kind of went back home, and again, things were kind of the way they were, goods and bads, ups and downs. But it didn't feel right. I mean, I felt like I was doing all the right things, and things still weren't improving the way that I imagined they would. And it was kind of sheer circumstance and random dumb luck that my daughter had been in the hospital, so we'd been taking turns staying with her and staying with our other child at home. And we went back and forth. And ultimately, we came back, and I had just had new internet installed in our house, which for whatever reason, I'd renamed to a new name. And in doing so, I had to change the security cameras to the new Wi Fi. I didn't realize when she had changed her passcode. But at some point in that time frame, I tried to unlock her phone just for some innocuous reason and realized, oh, she's changed her passcode. So when she came home, I said, hey, I need to use your phone because you're the admin on the account. I can't do anything with these cameras. You're the one that is the admin on the app. So she hands me the phone, and I go upstairs and start trying to connect the cameras, and I kind of looked at that phone, and I'd never really actually thought about going for a phone, even though she had been through mine a number of times. But in that instant, I just went, something doesn't feel right, and I just have to know. And I had like a flood of all the thoughts of time, circumstances, things I would look for if I had the opportunity to kind of look at her phone unfettered. And I just did a couple of quick searches, for common search terms that you would look for somebody who is cheating. And I didn't expect to find anything necessarily because she's a smart enough person that I think she would delete any direct evidence. But what she didn't account for was, talking about said instances with her friends. And sure enough, I found conversations that she had only a few months prior to her best friend about basically going out and sleeping with this one guy who I had no idea who he was or what his name was or anything. Now, let me step back and just say, when we had first decided to reconcile the first time, when I begged her to come back, at that point, I did confess to her everything I'd done. So there was full disclosure at that point, because at that point I said, look, if we're going to make this work, you need to tell me everything. And even at the time, I knew she had been on dates, and I said, have you slept with this guy that you've been going out to see? We were only supposed to just be kind of seeing what's out there. And she said, no, I haven't done that. I said, come on, I know you've been out. And she just adamantly denied it. And I said, look, I know you basically must have slept with this guy because you come home late, whatever. And she's like, well, if that's what you think, then you can think that if you want. Okay. And so at that point is when I had the speech of just like, look, if we're going to make this work, we got to be, completely honest with each other and give each other full disclosure. And then I told her everything that had happened with overseas and everything. That's really the only thing that had happened. But I gave her that and offered to answer any questions she had and full disclosure. And I said, it's important, to be fully honest. Otherwise, this isn't going to work. And then at that point, she goes, okay, well, maybe there was one more. And then she had told me about somebody that she had essentially been seeing for probably the prior year to that.
Okay, so this is when
So
you begged her to reconcile.
correct,
This is the first time when you were like you both had contacted an attorney. You're both like right
correct.
on the edge of or she actually beat you to the punch, I think is what you said, on
Yes,
filing. And then you kind of said, well, wait a minute, this is not what I want. I want to work on this marriage. So you're saying during that time you said to her, we have to have an open book uh
right.
policy going forward. And I got a little confused there. Did you like open your marriage there for a little bit?
No, it was mostly, well, it's kind of a vague situation, right? Like, which is also not great in terms of establishing boundaries. Towards the end, right before we had filed, it was sort of just like, if you want to get on the apps and see what's out there, then go for it. But we had no explicit conversation about like, hey, it's okay to sleep with people. It was mostly just like a, hey, is this the best you can get, or do you think you can get better? Go and see what's out there. So there was no real conversation, which again is sort of a dumpster fire of a situation. But yeah,
So going back to, you got on your phone, you're trying to figure out your security camera stuff at home,
right,
and then you found out through a correspondence with her best friend, her
yes.
discussing going out with another gentleman.
Right. And this was not the guy that she had told me about previously.
Okay, so now we know we're
So,
dealing with multiple men. If you'd like to support the show, or you have a question that you'd like me to answer on the podcast, consider buying me a coffee. Just go to buymeacoffee.com/thecheated. And if you want to ask me a question about infidelity or you need some advice, buy me a coffee, write me your question, and I'll read it on a future episode and do my best to answer it. Thank you to all my listeners and those who support the podcast. You motivate me every day to keep this show going. I couldn't do it without you.
Correct. So now I'm just like trying to put the pieces together, picking up all the breadcrumbs and realizing that this other guy is also probably a long duration affair. So I'm just kind of like numb in the moment. I mean, I just felt like somebody put me underground immediately. And I mean, she's downstairs busy with the kids, and I'm just like having this existential crisis of a moment upstairs. So I kind of like quickly collect myself and set up the cameras, and I had taken a bunch of shots of my phone of the conversations that I found, and I kind of collected myself and I went downstairs and I gave her a phone back and said, "Hey, I need to go for a run." And so, yeah, I walked out the house. I went, kind of for a walk, and I called my dad immediately, and I was just like, "Look, remember that conversation we had? Yeah, I think it's going down. Here's what I found." And he's like, "No, I understand. Well, we're here to support you in any way, we can. So just let us know what you need. Obviously, I'm not going to say anything to anybody until you tell me otherwise." And I said, "Yeah, just give me a couple of weeks. I need to put some plans together, and I'm going to keep this on the down low." So I did. I called the attorney right away and basically just said, "I'm ready. Let's go ahead and start the paperwork." And so we did that. And I came back and tried to live the best, fake life that I could for a few more weeks. And it's kind of bizarre, but in a way, I was trying to sort of mourn the death of this relationship that I thought I had. So I was being the best husband that I could be. I mean, we were having sex, like I was doing all the right things, and like she was kind of just like blown away in a way. Like it seemed kind of odd to her how over the top, good I was being as a husband, father, and all that things. But and in hindsight, she was kind of angry about the way that I treated her those last few weeks because it was almost more hurtful that I was being so good right before I filed for divorce. But I can't really get her to understand or really anybody else to understand. But in a way, that was me sort of living out the life that I thought I had before I kind of put the axe to it.
So when you found out on her phone that she had this affair, you did not confront her. You
No,
kept it to yourself for several weeks, contacted your attorney, and said, "Let's move forward, filing for divorce." But then you describe as your relationship as being seemingly healthy.
it's not unhealthy. It was basically a fantasy, right? It was living the perfect life, knowing full well that it was all a lie. So yeah, the best way I can describe it is, like I said, just mourning the death of this perfect marriage that I thought I had, and trying to get as much enjoyment out of that fantasy that I could, knowing that it was forever going to be changed.
Oh, I see.
So obviously, things progressed, and I was doing the best I could to hang on. I was trying to hold on a little bit longer, but I talked to my dad and I said, "I can't do this anymore. I can't live this lie anymore. I'm gonna have to move up the date." And I ultimately moved the date up earlier than I was initially anticipating, and it was probably the day before I had set to have her served at the house, and I'd made plans to leave town and all that. So everything was in place, and ironically enough, I created a profile on a dating app literally the day before this is all going to go down. Which, again, in hindsight, not a super healthy reaction. Not a super healthy thing to do in the face of a divorce. I recognize now that I need a lot of time by myself. But at the time, I was just sort of desperate for, companionship or whatever. And I just felt like my whole world was falling apart, which it's more just grasping at straws and trying to find a lifeline. And it was nice to talk to people. Yeah,
So you have two children at this point,
correct.
and how
Yep.
old are your children during this time?
At that time, they were like, let's see, 4 and 6 ish.
Okay. And so okay, so they're pretty young.
Yeah.
And are you getting all of that squared away with your attorney, just like custody and all that kind of stuff?
I mean, that's a conversation that was going to have to be had in the future. Just with my schedule and everything being so erratic, that was going to be something we would have to negotiate. But I mean, that was definitely on the table to discuss, but we hadn't even gotten that far yet. So, um, so the last night before all this stuff went down, um, I had literally just been talking to this girl on this app that day, like just first time started texting, and she texted me like, close to bedtime, and we're both in the bedroom, and my wife says, "Well, who's that?" I was like, "Oh, it's just a work chat or something." I mean, at this point, obviously, I'm lying because everything's about to go down in about 12 hours. And she said, "Well, let me see." And I said, "No, I'm not going to show you." Like, and so she immediately blows up and just says, "You're a fucking liar, and like, get out of the house, and you're a scumbag. I'm going to divorce you, this and that." And I was kind of anticipating this, obviously. And so I just said, "Well, do you want to talk about what you've been doing?" And we kind of got into this blow up. And she said, "I don't know what you're talking about. I've done nothing wrong, and you're a cheater, and you've always been a cheater, and you're a piece of shit, and all this other stuff." And I just said, "Well, and I started sort of trickling out some of the evidence I had. And I started obviously with some of the more innocuous stuff that I knew probably wasn't anything, but still stuff she was hiding. And she's, "Oh, that's nothing. That's just a friend that texted me, and I deleted it because I knew you would suspect something." And then I just kind of went, "Well, do you want to play it this way, or do you want to tell me what's been going on?" And she's just adamant that she did nothing wrong. So I told her, I was like, "Okay, well, I'll go sleep in the guest room. I'll be out tomorrow. I'm not leaving right now." But I took my stuff, went to the guest room, and I just regretfully unloaded an entire text chain with pictures and evidence and everything to her entire family, which again is
Wow.
not the best way to handle it, not the most mature, not the healthiest. But I was just so angry at the time, and honestly, the hair trigger for me was if she had just come clean and admitted it, that'd be one thing. But she was just doubling down and flipping the script on me being a scumbag and me being a cheater. And I was just like, no. So I unloaded everything to her family. And obviously, right away, I mean, she just starts blowing up from upstairs. "Oh, what are you talking about? Like, oh, that's nothing. And we just met up a couple times, and we just, hung out. All the nonsense excuses." Um, and it was just a range of emotions that night. Obviously, initially, she was very defensive and counter accusatory, and then it slowly turned into like, "Oh, he knows a lot more than I thought he did," and she couldn't really deny it anymore. And then she just got really sad and started crying, and "I can't believe it. My whole life is ruined," and this and that, and "oh, the kids," and this. And, it's just like, well, I don't know what to tell you, but we established some pretty firm boundaries in this reconciliation, and you broke them. And I asked you 1,000 times to tell me the truth if you wanted to see somebody else, if you wanted to get divorced, this and that. And so we just kind of went through that. I went to my family for support the next day, out of state, and of course, I immediately suffered all the accusations of like, "Well, you just get to abandon your kids and this and that, and while I have to sit here with my life blown up and take care of them." And I was just like, "Listen, I'm sorry, but like, I just have to leave the house. Like, I'm not useful for anything right now. I mean, my entire last 5 years has just been turned on its head. I don't even know what's real anymore. And I'm sorry about the kids, but this is what you did. This is not what I did." Um, so we
What
kind
was
of just went mostly,
just
yeah.
real quick? So you said you texted her family, or maybe your family too. I'm not sure. Some of this evidence that you had collected weeks before of her infidelity. What was the most scathing? What was the smoking gun evidence you had? Was it the conversation with the best friend?
Yeah, uh, and it was just like multiple texts of her outright lying. So there was a text chain that I had screenshotted between me and her when I was with the military out of state for a brief period of time, um, and her location got turned off. And I was just like, and I never heard from her the rest of the night. And I just texted her the next day, like, "Hey, everything okay? Get home late, and kind of waking up late. Like, what's going on?" And she's like, "Oh yeah, I went out to whatever, and I got home, and yeah, my phone died." And I screenshotted her location, which of course had her phone as online, not sharing a location. So clearly her phone wasn't dead. It was just she turned her location off. And that same conversation was being had in parallel with her friend going, "Oh, he texted me this, and yeah, I went out with such and such last night, but don't tell him, tell him, I went out with you last night," kind of a thing. Um, and then this happened at least a couple times that I found evidence of, but I know it obviously happened a lot more. I mean, one of them was like she had gone out the night before. She was supposed to cook like Mother's Day at her mother's the next day, and she's like super hungover and really snappy with me the next day while she's preparing the Mother's Day celebration. Meanwhile, the night before, she went out and banged this dude. So just lots of pretty clear evidence. I mean, all but actually having pictures and videos, it was pretty much admissions of what she had done. So it was pretty clear. But obviously, I got no response to that, and I didn't expect anything from that. I mean, her family is very much on her side, no matter what she does. So I didn't expect them to say anything to me. But I actually did get some of her more distant relatives to text me, just saying like I'm really sorry, and her brothers had texted me and tried to convince me otherwise, and don't give up on the marriage and this and that. I was just like, I don't know. I don't know what to tell you, but there's some stuff that's forgivable, but multiple partners over multiple years, I can't do it.
Was there any evidence that, because I'm a little confused. So you're saying there were multiple men that she was with?
Yeah, so there was the one that she had admitted to me after I told her about mine.
Okay.
In addition to the guy she was sleeping with at the time from the apps, um, and then there was this third guy now that I found out without her telling me anything after we had reconciled. So as far as I knew, there was at least three guys she had slept with since we'd been married.
Okay, so it all blows up that night, and you go
Yeah,
to the guest room or living room, whatever, and then you did. So was she served the next day? What happens next?
yeah. So she came downstairs and just kind of like once it had all kind of hit her and she'd settled down a little bit, she just came down and just said like, "So do I need to get a lawyer?" And I was like, I mean, that's up to you, but you just need to be here tomorrow night because you're getting served. And she kind of looked at me like blown away, realizing like the gravity of everything and how long I'd been prepared. And she said, "You have a lawyer?" I said, "Yep." She goes, "You got papers ready?" I go, "Yep." She's like, "I'm being served tonight?" Yep. And so that's where she kind of like turned the corner from being angry and on the offensive to just super sad and super regretful and crying and this and that and give me another chance. And that's why I had to get away because I knew that a lot of that would be very convincing to me, and I did feel bad. I didn't want to leave her. I really wanted to make it work, but I didn't know how to reconcile everything that had happened to make that a reality going forward. And I didn't know how to trust her again because it's one thing for me to to get over cheating and infidelity, but it's just like the continued lying. Like how many times can you be lied to before the trust is just gone? And I don't really know a way to repair that. So that's kind of where I was at. I left, went to my parents' place. I'd come back, um, and I stayed with the kids. She left, and I was obviously talking to this other girl at the time, which again recognized as not healthy. But I was sort of leaping into something else way too quickly.
This is a girl that you met through like a dating app, and you haven't met her or slept with her. You're just talking to her online.
Yeah, it was literally the first day that we had started talking. The day before I filed on her, that this whole thing blew up because she had texted me. That was that same girl.
Oh, okay.
So I left and came back and stayed with the kids, and we kind of worked out how this is going to go forward. And I left to do some military work for a couple months that I had arranged as part of my exit strategy, just so I wouldn't have to stay in the house. And I again, I was in a really dark place because I really didn't want to leave her. I loved her. I still love her, but I didn't know how it was possible to stay with somebody after so much lying and betrayal. Which again, it's a really tough situation when I'm also guilty of it in the past. But at this point, it's been many years since I had done anything wrong, and I felt like guilty because yeah, I've got a part to play, but at the same time, we've been through reconciliation. We established boundaries and ground rules, and she's basically continually violated them over the entire last year. So I don't know how it's possible to stay with her. So that's kind of where I'm at. And ultimately I leave. I go overseas again, and we end up yeah, the girl that I was seeing at the time, I'd seen her a handful of times, and we'd slept together and whatever else, and it was really good. But at the same time, I was obviously a completely broken person, and I was in no position to try to leap into another relationship. And in hindsight, I recognize that in and of itself is kind of toxic and in a way a bit abusive for me to do that to somebody else, because essentially I'm using them, even though it wasn't intentional at the time. I'm kind of using them as this like emotional band aid.
But you're
So it really wasn't
divorced?
fair to.
You're divorced at this point?
No, no, no. This is on my way out the door after filing um, with this other girl that I was seeing at the time. So I kind of broke it off with her too, because she was, even though she knew my whole situation, she knew I wasn't divorced, but I was filing. She knew everything. I was completely honest with her. I think she was still, in spite of all that, in spite of telling me she was understanding, she still probably wanted more. And it kind of came to a head where that kind of came to the forefront. And I was like, look, it's not fair to you to do this to you. I'm just not in a place where I can give you what you want. So I kind of broke it off with her. I left the country and I was just sort of solo overseas. And, you know, it's difficult because as much as I wanted to break off talking to my wife at the time to sort of get some no contact and separation, you just can't do that with kids. So
No.
we continued talking, and I just asked her. I was like, "Look, I hope you get the help you need, and figure out what it is about you that we couldn't work, and what caused you to do this. But I want to be with you. I just can't." And that sort of evolved over time to ultimately her, convincing me that she's going to be different. And she really wasn't into the first reconciliation. She kind of did it out of pity. She really realizes now what she's going to lose, and it probably took a few days, but ultimately she kind of talked me into pausing the divorce. And so yeah, it was kind of this bizarre turn of events where I was like, okay, and she really was convincing, and she started behaving differently, and she started giving me a lot more disclosure about things that had happened, things that she refused to talk about previously, and would try to give vague answers and change the subject. She was giving me a lot of honesty and a lot of truth, and was being genuine, or so I thought. And so I kind of agreed. I was like, okay, well, let's figure this out, and we should both do therapy, because she always assumed that I was the problem and I needed therapy, and she never needed anything. And so she started going to therapy, and things kind of just kept on getting better and better. And it just seemed like we turned a new chapter, and things were amazing. And this is all happening while I'm overseas. So I'm like, I wonder how it's going to change when I come home. And I came home, and she came out to visit me where I was at the military back stateside, and we had a great birthday weekend, and things were amazing. And it felt like for the first time ever, things weren't rapidly deteriorating the way they were before. And so I was really hopeful that things were different. And all the while, my family is just like, okay, like we're happy for you, but like, this just doesn't seem like a good idea. Like, we can't tell you what to do, but you've been through this before. Like, I just, it doesn't make sense. But I mean, if that's your choice, like, we'll support you. We're happy. Like, great. But I mean, you can tell they were just very dubious of this whole situation. And so, yeah, I mean, I came back and, sort of established a regular home life. And yeah, she wasn't going to her parents all the time, which is sort of the circumstance where she would cheat. She'd drop the kids off and leave the house and whatever while I was gone. She was always at the house. Location was being shared. The cameras were on, so I could see what she was doing. It's just like trying to, do the right thing and establish that trust again. And I'd say it probably lasted for a good, 6 months or so. But then, things started slowly creeping back. It was never as bad as it was before. She wasn't like name calling or anything, but it was just kind of argumentative and causing fights where there just really didn't need to be a fight. And I don't know. It's something inside me just said it felt a lot like it used to feel. Not as bad, but similar. And I kind of kept it to myself. I was like, maybe I'm just imagining things. And I don't know. So I kind of just kept on keeping on, and tried to do the best I could. But you know, things kind of just kept on going the way they were going, and being kind of good, but like also little hints of bad. And the next real major issue that I had was, at one point she had gone through my phone, I guess this past fall or whatever, and I found a conversation that I'd had with my sister, and just started blowing me up saying, oh, I said awful things about her and this and that. And I was complaining about some of the things and, like finances and, other issues that we were having at the time. And she just felt very like violated that I was saying all this horrible stuff about her, which, I wasn't really saying horrible stuff about her. It was just mostly me speaking about frustration to my sister, which is kind of, a pretty confidential conversation. So I kind of was on the defensive and I just said, look, like, we have these issues and you don't really want to work with them. We don't want to do a budget or any of these other things. But in the aftermath of that conversation, I realized like, well, wait a second, like, why is she going through my phone? And it kind of made me wonder, like, is this like projection? Does she think I'm doing anything wrong? I mean, obviously I wasn't, so she didn't find anything. So I think she was like grasping at anything she could to attack me for. And, it was the first time that since we had reconciled the second time that I was like, what's going on with her? And I had never questioned her up until that point. But at that point, I decided I need to look in her phone because what is she looking through mine for? I felt like maybe she's projecting something on me. So, at some point I sneak into her phone, which again, this whole back and forth with phones is so toxic and ridiculous, but it is what it is. And I obviously at this point I know whenever you confront a cheater with stuff, all it does is make them, hide better and delete stuff. And I know there's going to be almost no evidence on her phone. So I'm starting to look in like oblique ways and trying to find weird breadcrumbs that I can connect the dots. And the way I do that is, I opened up various different social media apps and her block contact lists, and I found this, new person on one of her social media accounts that she had blocked. And this is like after the affair partner that she had blocked when we had reconciled the second time. So this is some new guy who's like been in the last year.
This is just within the last year. That's what I was going to ask you. Like, how recent are we talking? Okay.
Yes, this is after the second reconciliation. This is like last fall where I'm like, who's this guy and why are you blocking him? And it's not like a spam account. Like I can tell the difference. I looked him up. Oh, it's a real account and it's somebody who's local. So it's like, who's this guy and why are you blocking him and why have I never heard about him before? So I kind of immediately just went right to, oh, this is another affair partner that she's hiding. And then I kind of left it at that. I didn't want to confront her again. I wanted to kind of give myself time to process and figure out the best way to approach this because I know, again, the more I confront her without sufficient evidence, the more she's just going to bury things deeper and hide better. So I let it go. And then, at some point I bring up the name of like, oh, who's this guy? Oh, he's nothing. He's somebody I met out, when I would go out with such and such to the bar. And yeah, he was probably interested in me, but nothing ever happened. I tried to set him up with my sister, this and that. And it's like, okay, whatever. It sounds like nonsense. I don't know why you would block somebody over that, but she had blocked his number and social media account. And so I kind of let that go. And then later on, over the winter, I think it was like right around New Year's. Anyway, I'm walking through the kitchen and I'm not even looking at her phone. Her phone's sitting on the counter, and I notice something pop up on her phone, and it's like midnight. So I'm like, it's either spam or it's somebody like that she shouldn't be talking to. So I look over and I see a number, and it's just basically like a pretty vague text of like, "Hey, are you still around?" And I open it up and I recognize it as somebody on her block list. Like this is like WhatsApp, and she had blocked the number or whatever, so he was able to contact her by some other means. I was like, it's somebody she'd always explain, like, oh, she's never done anything with him. He tried to proposition her, but she's not interested. He's not her type, whatever. I'm like, oh, why is he texting you at midnight? And so I kind of let it be, and I go, all right, let's see what happens. Because during the second reconciliation, I set up pretty clear boundaries. Like, you need to be fully honest. Like, if anything ever happens that's like suspicious, if you just share it with me, it's not suspicious. Even if something is innocuous, but you start deleting it or hiding it, that's immediately suspicious, and I'm going to assume the worst. So again, not a healthy response, but I kind of almost wanted to test her to see what's she going to do with this. So I leave her phone alone, and I wait a couple days, and she never shares it with me. So at some point, we have a conversation where I kind of let her know, like, look, I love you. I'm happy with the way things have been this last year, but I'm having some issues trusting you because there's a lot of things that aren't making sense. And then eventually we get to this thing where I'm like, well, show me this WhatsApp you got, and she's like, what? And I open up her WhatsApp, and of course the text chain's deleted. I was like, well, what about this guy that texted you the other night? I show her the screenshot. She's like, oh, him? Oh yeah, he's nobody. And like, I just figured like if he had texted me, it was going to start this whole conversation I didn't want to have. So I just deleted it. It was nothing. I'm not interested in him. And so, that started another argument. But the most damning thing that I found was essentially that she had unblocked and reblocked her affair partner about a week prior to that. So like right around the new year of this year.
Which one?
The one that I had found the conversations with that caused me to file that time where I blew up with her
Okay,
family.
gotcha.
So she had unblocked and reblocked his social media like in January. So the next conversation we have is just like, how do you explain this? Like, who's this new guy that you unblocked and reblocked like 3 weeks ago? Why is the affair partner that you had for multiple years? Why are you unblocking and reblocking him days ago? And of course, all the answers, you want to believe. You talk yourself into the delusion of saying it makes sense, but it was just nonsense. It was just like, well, I just, I always know he wanted to get back with his wife, and I was just trying to check up on him to see if he had gotten back with his wife. And, this other guy, I want to see if he had gotten with his baby. It's like, none of these answers make sense. Like, if you have an affair partner and you reconcile, like, they're dead to you. You don't look at them, you don't talk to them, you don't check up on them. It's nonsense. But in the moment, I mean, what am I going to say? I don't have any other evidence. So I'm just like, okay, that doesn't really make sense, but sure. But at that point, it kind of became too much for me. And, I just told her, I was like, I don't know if this is a me problem or a you problem. I don't have any evidence you've done anything, but like, I just don't know that I'm ever going to be able to trust you again, because you're constantly lying to me. And it's not a tenable situation for me. I don't want to live the next 40 years of my life in this like hyper vigilant state. So if that's a me problem, then I'm sorry, but I don't know how to get past my feelings. And, I just don't know if it's going to work. So we kind of had another divorce conversation, and that blew up into a whole thing. And, you know, the, I had talked to my dad about this, ongoing situation and all the things I'd found recently. And, he suggested doing marriage counseling. He's like, look, you guys have been through a lot, but the one thing you probably should be doing in a situation like this is marriage counseling. And it's honestly the only thing you haven't done. I mean, we've both been to individual counseling, but not marriage counseling. So she had suggested that the night that we had the conversation, like, well, let's just do marriage counseling. I was like, I don't know. I don't know if that's going to work. I don't know if that's going to change my feelings. But so we kind of blew up that night and let it be. She went to her parents' house the next day. And again, to take full ownership of my part, I definitely reached out to the girl that I had seen, a year and a half prior, when I'd filed for divorce the last time. Of course, she's like not interested at this point at all. So she's like, yeah, I don't really want to talk to you anymore. So I left it at that. Fine. But again, it's just me grasping at like an emotional life preserver, which is not a good situation. But at that point, the more I thought about it, the more I was like, what am I doing? Like, my dad's right. We need to do marriage counseling. Again, the guilt of the situation of like, have I done everything I can do to make this work? And the answer is no. I mean, that's the last thing we haven't done. So, we talk the next day, and I say, should we do marriage counseling? I'm open to it. I'm not promising you it's going to change my mind, but it is the one thing we haven't done. And she says, well, is this just because your other plan didn't work out? And I'm just like, well, no. Like, I was wanting to divorce you whether or not I had somebody else on the side, but that's irrelevant. But no, I want to do this because I'm guilty. And it's the only thing that I think we haven't done to possibly give it a chance. So ultimately she relents and says, okay, fine, let's try marriage counseling. So we kind of keep the status quo at that point. And we're just like, well, we'll just, we know it's on the table, but we'll just kind of keep going on until we can get into a therapist and see how this works. Again, I go overseas for a short stint, and things are tenuous. I'm trying to sort of distance myself from her because again, I'm pretty much 1 foot out the door in this situation, but I do want to at least give marriage counseling a chance to perhaps change my feelings on the situation. But I'm mostly just, FaceTiming with the kids and keeping her at arm's length. And one of the biggest things that I noticed right off the bat is the less I interacted with her and the more that I kept her at arm's length and the more that I was away from her, the more at peace I felt. the calmer I felt, the happier I felt. And that to me was sort of enlightening. And the fact that like, I think this whole toxic situation has really been taking a toll on my mental health for a number of years. And it was crazy to me that like by stepping off this emotional roller coaster and engaging with her every day, I actually started to feel better. And that's actually something I read about a lot in some of these infidelity books, of just like recognizing a bad situation for what it is. But one of these conversations that we had right around my birthday, she had called me and wished me happy birthday. And I was just kind of talking to her as minimally as I could. I expressed to her, I said, look, it's not even the affairs. Like, the decision to reconcile after infidelity is a black and white decision. It's either you will or you won't. And I was willing to make that choice. And obviously you were too. But with that, it's full disclosure, full accountability without condition, and, contrition and all these things that you have to do that are requisite for infidelity recovery, that you just haven't done any of those things. And you keep lying to me. And the lying is the most important thing to me. I'd rather you tell me the truth instead of deciding what it is I should or shouldn't know that's going to hurt my feelings or not. I told you what my boundaries were. You need to be honest with me, or I can't stay in a marriage. And she, understood and recognized what I was saying. And I said, so are you still going to stick with your story about this last guy that, you blocked on social media? And she said, well, okay, like one time I did hook up with him, and then, slowly but surely she trickled truth me on essentially a fourth affair partner that she had. But, of course, swore that this was many years ago. But again, it makes you question, well, why did he all of a sudden get blocked, a month or two ago? But anyway, so that's the latest, um, discovery on my part of, her infidelity. But we went to couples therapy and we've been working through it. And obviously we're at the stage now where we're working through disclosure. My therapist, or our therapist, was talking about, a bunch of other things and how to, fix our dynamic and our communication. And I just said, look, like, that's all well and good. And I understand you're the expert, but to me, the disclosure is the most important thing, because that's the decision point of, is she going to be honest with me or not? And everything after that, it's almost irrelevant. If she won't give me full honesty, then what's the point? It's polishing the brass in the Titanic. So that's kind of where we left things off. And I guess the last part of this insane chapter is, most recently, obviously since the latest discussion of divorce, I realized she had changed her passcode again on her phone, which of course she, claims it's like, well, I don't want you reading conversations I had with my mom or whatever. I was like, okay, fine. But at some point I saw my daughter enter her passcode on her phone. So of course I, took the opportunity again to open it up, and I started searching for some stuff and found out some even more damning evidence of things that she's continued to lie about to this day. Things like, oh, she brought the affair partners to the house, and things that I'd asked her about explicitly previously that she was adamant she hadn't done. And just other things that draw into question a whole lot of other motivations that she had, like, infidelity recovery stuff that I had recommended she read during the first reconciliation that she ignored for months on end because she had no interest. But when I had filed on her a year and a half ago, and she came back to me, fully accountable, fully contrite, and talking about those same affair recovery books and videos that I'd asked her to read, it turns out that her affair partner actually sent her that stuff to watch. And that's where she got it from. It's not even like she took it from me. She suggested, oh, you should watch this, as if I'd never heard of it, when I told her, hey, this is stuff I gave you 6 months ago that you didn't want. But it took her affair partner giving it to her to actually watch it, which is sort of sick and twisted. But there's a lot of recent stuff that I've realized that she's still holding on to a ton of lies and a ton of, minimization that I don't even know the full scope of things. I realize now, going back even to the very earliest parts of our relationship and marriage, that she had lied about a lot of things. I mean, I remember early on when we had first moved in together, when I'd moved out of state, I mean, she had moved up there to be with me, and she started going through my things in the garage. Like, my household goods had just gotten there. I hadn't even seen them in over like a year, because I went through like a 6-month training, whatever. And she started finding like old letters and stuff from, girls I'd talked to like a year before, like well before I'd even known her. And I hadn't even been in that box yet, because it had just gotten delivered. She went through it while I was at work. I came home and she was just like absolutely livid. I mean, actually, it hit me that day and was just screaming at me, telling me she's going to leave and all this other stuff. And she had had a big problem with me talking to girls that I'd previously been with. And at the time, it was just like totally innocent, just like friendly catch up. But like, you can't talk to anybody you've ever had a relationship with or slept with. But meanwhile, I've recently discovered she was talking to guys she had slept with in the earliest parts of our relationship. I mean, even calling them pet names, babe, and I love you, and this and that. So it's just like, how much of our history has been a complete lie? How much of this has been just like this completely hypocritical, double standard where she held me accountable for a lot of things that ultimately she was probably doing herself. And how much of that really led to a point where her emotional abuse over the years was maybe in large part because of things she was doing that, ultimately left me in a place where I was willing to cheat. Again, not blaming her, but it's just I have a strong suspicion that the cheating goes well beyond even the partners that I know about and probably a lot earlier. So that's kind of where we're at. And at this point, we're going through the motions in therapy, and I'm waiting for full disclosure. But I think she's unwilling, to be fully honest. And I don't think that's ever going to change. And I think I'm finally at a place where I just need to break free of this insanity because it's taken a toll on my mental health for many years. And I realized that, it's like an addiction. You get a little withdrawal and you go back. But like ultimately, if you can fight through the withdrawal, it's a lot brighter on the other side. And I just have to trust that that's the case here.
Wow, that is that's quite a story, Gabe. I think a lot of people would say to you, I mean, I have several questions, but I'm not going to ask a whole lot. I'm going to ask a couple questions. I think a lot of people would say you're both very much culpable for this web that you've woven.
Yes.
There is a complete breakdown of trust. Both of you have contributed to the breakdown of that trust. I understand that she's very possibly done it way more than you have, but I mean, at this point, who's really keeping score? That's my instinctual response because I understand that she has had, it sounds like, multiple affair partners. I kind of lost count, maybe four minimum, maybe more.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how many there are. Maybe you've had one or two. It's kind of an unusual story in that some might say, well, you kind of deserve each other. You're both sort of contributing to your own problem that you're in, and it does take two to tango. Some stories of infidelity are really cut and dry. One person cheats, the other person's purely innocent. Life
Yeah.
is rarely that black and white, as we all know. There's a lot
Right.
of gray, and your story is filled with gray. It's filled with
Yeah.
a lot of push and pull. It does sounds like your job, the nature of your profession that takes you out of town has such a detrimental effect. And I've read many stories of military families that deal with infidelity. It's very common. It's very unfortunate. It's very sad that it is such a common situation. I get it. People are alone and there's a distance, and you want to reach out and have some kind of relationship that you don't feel like you have. It certainly not, you don't have the immediacy of that relationship because that person's out of town. So I understand that that is a thread that weaves its way through your entire relationship. I don't think it's I don't think it's the reason. I think people are the reason that you cheat, not your circumstances. From that standpoint, as I said, you're both culpable for the circumstances that you found yourselves in. It sounds like you're in the middle of marriage counseling still. You're not divorced, you're still together, but it sounds to me like you've kind of given up, at least internally. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, like I said, everybody likes to focus on the infidelity itself, but to me, the trust is almost irreparably damaged. And you're absolutely right. We are both culpable in a lot of ways for a lot of things. But, you know, part of infidelity recovery is essentially that whatever your relationship was before, you have to burn it down, right? Like you have to start fresh, and it's essentially a new relationship. So while you can't necessarily always forget the things in the past, to some extent, you kind of have to start a new relationship. And, you know, I certainly cheated. She certainly cheated. But even that first reconciliation, that's a new decision point of like, are we willing to look past infidelity and start a new relationship? If the answer is yes, then you kind of have to let all that stuff go in the past. And we certainly didn't do the right things in terms of getting couples counseling at the time. But in our own ways, we tried to do what we did. But the other element is, one of the reasons that people get divorced in a lot, really the primary reason is more philosophical and that people grow apart, right? And that could be in a number of different ways. And our therapist talked about that specifically of like, let's say somebody's an addict or whatever, and they get sober and they grow, but their partner doesn't do any of the work. And so essentially that person gets better, the other person doesn't. You split apart. And in a lot of ways, that's kind of what I view about like the infidelity recovery of like, I did a lot of the work, especially that first time of going to therapy and taking care of myself and all the things that, she was looking for me to improve upon. But I don't ever feel like she put in really any of the work, and any of the work that she did was superficial because she obviously continued cheating the whole time. And I'm not trying to stand on some sort of moral high ground, but again, it's like after a reconciliation, it's kind of like you everybody's back to zero. So you kind of have to keep score in some respect to go, is this really what you want? And she's made it pretty apparent to me through two different reconciliations now that this isn't what she wants. And I have been faithful for the last, so many years. Um, and she hasn't. So it makes it pretty clear to me that I don't think this behavior is going to change. And whether that's something pathological or whether it's just she doesn't want to be with me and she just is too scared to admit that, I just don't think her behavior is going to change. So I don't really know what way forward there is to really rebuild that trust.
I ask every guest that I have this question. This is my final question. What advice would you give to another, I guess, another couple or another man, another person that's in a similar situation that you've dealt with? What would you say to them?
I would say that infidelity is definitely a murky subject, and it's a spectrum, right? It's a continuum. People say cheating is cheating, and I don't really buy that. I mean, like you said, reconciliation is possible, but there's a series of things that you have to do, and I think that it's going to sound apologist on my part, but there's a difference between a one-time mistake that drunken endeavor at night on out of town at a convention that you come back and you're immediately contrite and admit to everything, take full accountability to, and somebody that's like multiple partner, multi-year affair that you hide and lie even in spite of direct evidence. And I'm not saying either of us fits neatly into either one of those categories, but I will say that it's an uphill battle, but you have to recognize it for what it is. And if you have no ties to the person, no kids or anything, I would say probably just get out because it's not worth it. But obviously, things get muddied a little bit when you have kids and entanglements, and it's a really personal decision that you have to make for yourself. That I've made a couple times now to stay in, but ultimately, the statistics aren't very good, especially in a case of like serial infidelity.
Thank you for sharing your story with us, Gabe. I really kind of hope for the best for both of you. You both probably need to figure out what you really want. The one thing kept running through my mind as you told your story is, why do they keep trying? Like, I give you both an A for effort. It's sideways effort. It's not really, healthy effort in my opinion. I mean, you have definitely tried, both of you, don't get me wrong. But if she's a serial cheater, and she clearly is, you're not I don't know how often this topic comes up in your therapy, but and I'm not sure what your therapist is telling you, but yeah, you will not be able to sustain a marriage with anyone that refuses to change their ways. Reconciliation is already very, very difficult, as anyone will tell you. I don't think it's impossible. A lot of people do. I don't think it's impossible, but I do think it takes tremendous effort. And yeah, you have to start your relationship over again. I hope you'll come back and talk to us again and kind of update us on how things are progressing in your life, whether you end up reconciling and trying to figure out if you can fix your relationship. I would be very curious to know. To me, it sounds like you're kind of checked out mentally. But regardless, I wish you the best. You both deserve happiness. Both of you deserve love and compassion. Please remember as you navigate through this conclusion to whatever your story is, whether you're together or you're divorced, that you are not alone. Millions of people deal with this issue every single day, and it's not easy. It's very heartbreaking. It breaks families and marriages apart every single day. But regardless, we support you. We want to see you get through this and arrive on the other side a happier and healthier and stronger person in whatever form that takes. Thank you again, Gabe, for coming on.
Thanks, Bruno. Appreciate it.
If you're interested in coming on the program and sharing your story of infidelity, please email us at stories@thecheated.show.